What would you do if the only thing you could afford in the entire world was a ghost? Not a spirit, but a place so forgotten it might as well be one. Imagine being 17 years old, with nothing to your name but $2 silver and a grief so heavy it feels like a second skeleton inside your own. That was the world Sadie Lerner faced in the Arizona Territory of 1882, when she bought a collapsed and timbered-over mine shaft that the rest of the world had dismissed as a tomb. They laughed at her for it, but the truth waiting under all that rock and silence was a story of murder, a hidden fortune, and a secret that would not only rewrite her own past, but the very foundation of the town that had cast her out. So settle in, and let us know where you're watching from, because this is the story of a girl who dug for shelter and found a reckoning instead. Sadie Lerner arrived in redemption with the sun at her back and the dust of a dozen forgotten towns coating her worn dress. She was a ghost herself, thin and quiet, with eyes that had seen too much of the world's finality. Cholera had swept through the camp where she'd lived with her aunt, taking the last of her known kin and leaving Sadie with a silence that rang louder than any church bell. She had walked for 3 days, following a wagon trail that shimmered in the heat, her father's old tin canteen her only companion. The water inside was warm and tasted of metal and memory. Her destination was chosen for its name alone: redemption. It was a fine-sounding word for a place that felt like the end of the line. A collection of sun-bleached plank buildings huddled against a vast, indifferent expanse of red rock and cactus. Her boots, the leather cracked and thin, left faint prints in the deep dust of the main street, prints that the wind began erasing the moment she passed. The town watched her with the lazy, suspicious curiosity of a place that didn't welcome strangers, especially not those who arrived on foot with nothing but the clothes they stood in. Men on the saloon porch paused their talk, their eyes lingering on her, not with kindness, but with appraisal. Women peered from behind curtains, their faces grim. Sadie felt their judgment like a physical weight, another layer on top of the exhaustion and the hollow ache in her chest. She had learned long ago that the world sorted people into 2 piles, those with something and those with nothing. She was firmly in the second pile. In her pocket, her fingers traced the edges of $2 silver, the entirety of her inheritance. It was enough for a few meals, maybe a week in a boarding house room if she was lucky, and then she would be back to nothing. The thought was a cold stone in her gut. She needed more than a meal. She needed a foothold, a place to stand where the world couldn't blow her away. She passed the marshal's office, the assayer's, the mercantile with its barrels of flour and bolts of calico. And then she saw it, tacked to a post outside the land office. A notice, its corners curled by the sun, announcing the auction of delinquent claims. Most were listed with back taxes in the hundreds of dollars, but one was different. Lot 73. A collapsed mine shaft listed as unworkable and abandoned. The debt owed was $1. The auction was in an hour. It was a grave, the notice implied, a hole in the ground good for nothing. But to Sadie, a hole in the ground she could own felt safer than the wide, open vulnerability of the world. A grave, at least, was a place to be. She straightened her shoulders, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and walked toward the land office. The sun beat down on her head, hot and unforgiving, but for the first time in days, she felt the faint stirring of something other than loss. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something harder, something more practical. It was resolve. She had $2. The mine cost $1. That left $1 for a shovel. It was a plan made of dust and desperation, but it was a plan, and it was hers. The men on the saloon porch watched her go, a few of them chuckling into their glasses, unaware that they were witnessing the quiet beginning of a story that would soon hold their entire town in its grip. They saw a girl with nothing, They had no idea what she was about to find. The auction took place on the steps of the land office, a hurried affair overseen by a man with a sweat-stained collar and a voice that sounded like gravel rolling downhill. A small crowd of prospectors and landowners had gathered, most of them waiting for the more promising claims to come up. When the auctioneer called out, "Lot 73, the old widow's folly," a ripple of dry laughter went through the men. Sadie stood at the edge of the crowd, her presence small and unnoticed, until the auctioneer asked for an opening bid. Silence. The men shuffled their feet, their expressions a mix of pity and contempt for the worthless plot. From the center of the crowd, a man in a clean duster coat and a fine hat spoke, his voice carrying an easy authority. "$1 for the paperwork, maybe," he said, and the men around him laughed again. This was Marcus Thorne, a name Sadie had already heard spoken with reverence in her first hour in town. He owned the mercantile, the saloon, and the richest silver claim in the county. His face was handsome, but his eyes were cold and dismissive as they swept over the crowd and landed for a moment on Sadie. $1 is the bid," the auctioneer droned, eager to move on. "Do I hear two?" The silence stretched, thick with heat and indifference. Sadie's heart hammered against her ribs. It was now or never. She took a half step forward, her voice barely a whisper, but clear in the sudden quiet. $2. Every head turned. The laughter died, replaced by stunned disbelief. Marcus Thorne's smile tightened into a sneer. He looked at her as if she were a piece of trash the wind had blown in. "The girl bids $2, he announced, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "Looks like we have a speculator in our midst." The men chuckled, but the sound was more uncertain now. They were looking at her, really looking, and what they saw was a child playing a game she didn't understand. The auctioneer, surprised, looked at Sadie. "The bid is $2 from the young lady." He didn't wait for another. "Sold! For $2. He banged a small wooden gavel on the rail. Just like that, it was done. Sadie walked forward through the parting crowd, the dust muffling her footsteps. She placed her 2 silver dollars on the wooden counter inside the land office, the coins making a small, definitive sound. The clerk, without looking at her, slid a folded deed across the worn wood. Her name, Sadie Lerner, was written in fresh ink. It was the first thing she had owned in her life. She folded the paper and tucked it safely into her dress pocket. As she turned to leave, she felt the weight of Marcus Thorne's gaze on her back, cold and sharp as a winter nail. What could a 17-year-old girl, orphaned and alone, possibly do with a collapsed and forgotten mine? What secret was buried so deep under tons of rock that an entire town had dismissed it as worthless? Let us know in the comments what you think Sadie should do next, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of forgotten history and incredible discovery. For Sadie, holding that deed, the mockery of the town was nothing more than a faint buzzing in the distance. The only thing that mattered was the deep, undeniable feeling that she had just purchased the key to her own survival. As Sadie walked away from the land office, the deed a warm, crisp square against her skin, the whispers of the town followed her like a second shadow. She heard the word orphan murmured, followed by fool. The laughter was quieter now, replaced by a kind of pitying scorn. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, her face a careful mask of neutrality. She had spent years learning to build walls inside herself, places where the world's casual cruelty couldn't reach. She passed a small adobe house with a porch draped in drying chilies. An old woman sat in a rocking chair, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her eyes dark and watchful. She was Papago, Sadie guessed, one of the ancient people of this land. As Sadie drew level, the woman's rocking stilled. She looked directly at Sadie, not with pity, but with a deep, penetrating intensity. The woman spoke, her voice low and raspy, like stones rubbing together. "Some stones hold a voice," she said, the words hanging in the dry air. "You must listen with your hands." Sadie paused, the strange words settling into her. She didn't understand them, but she felt their weight. She gave a small, respectful nod, and the old woman nodded back before resuming her slow, rhythmic rocking. The encounter was brief, a tiny island of cryptic stillness in a sea of mockery, but Sadie carried the woman's words with her as she walked on. She used her last dollar at the Mercantile, a place that smelled of coffee beans, leather, and Marcus Thorne's prosperity. Thorne himself was behind the counter, totaling figures in a ledger. He looked up as she entered, his expression hardening. She ignored him, her gaze scanning the tools hanging on the wall. A sturdy shovel, a pickaxe with a solid hickory handle. She had enough for one. The shovel was more practical for moving loose rock. "I need that shovel," she said, her voice even. Thorne closed his ledger with a soft snap. He came around the counter, his polished boots making no sound on the floorboards. He was a large man, and he used his size to intimidate, looming over her. "That mine is a death trap, girl," he said, his voice a low, paternalistic growl. "A fool's bet. I'll give you $5 for that deed, a tidy profit for you, enough to get you on a stagecoach to somewhere you belong." He saw her not as a person, but as a problem to be tidied up and sent away. Sadie met his gaze. She saw the flicker of something in his eyes, not concern, but a sharp, acquisitive glint. It was the look of a man who wanted something he was pretending was worthless. "The shovel," she repeated, her voice unwavering. A muscle twitched in Thorne's jaw. The pretense of kindness vanished. "Fine," he snapped. "Waste your dollar. But when that hill collapses on you, don't come crying to me." He took her coin, his fingers brushing hers with a touch that felt like ice, and shoved the shovel into her hands. As she left the store, the shovel heavy on her shoulder, she felt more certain than ever. Marcus Thorne, the most powerful man in redemption, was afraid of a collapsed mine shaft. The question was why. The walk to Lot 73 was long, leading her away from the town and up into the scorched, rocky hills that bled heat back into the sky. The landscape was brutal and magnificent, a place of sharp edges and deep shadows. The sun was relentless, and by the time she found the marker, a splintered wooden post with the number 73 carved into it, her dress was soaked with sweat, and her canteen was nearly empty. The sight was worse than she had imagined. It wasn't just a collapsed entrance. It was an entire section of the hillside that had given way. A chaotic jumble of rock, dirt, and splintered, sun-bleached timbers lay in a heap where a mine opening should have been. It looked ancient, impassable, a wound in the earth that had long since scarred over. Any hope she had carried up the hill withered in the oppressive heat. The townspeople were right. She had bought a grave. Disappointment, sharp and bitter, rose in her throat. She sank to the ground, the shovel clattering beside her. The silence was absolute, broken only by the buzz of a fly and the faint, whispery sound of the wind moving through the brittle scrub. She was utterly alone, in a place that promised nothing but back-breaking labor and, most likely, failure. She stayed there as the afternoon bled into evening, watching the light change on the rocks. The harsh glare of midday softened into the warm, golden hues of dusk. The angry red of the landscape deepened into shades of purple and indigo. The air cooled, carrying the scent of dust and dry sage. In the fading light, the pile of rubble seemed less like a barrier and more like a puzzle. She got to her feet and walked closer, her hand resting on a massive gray boulder. The rock was still warm from the day's sun. She laid her cheek against it, closing her eyes. She thought of the old woman's words, "Listen with your hands." She ran her palms over the rough surfaces of the fallen timbers. the sharp edges of the shattered rock. She felt the grain of the wood, the grit of the stone. She wasn't listening for a sound, but for a story, for a logic to the chaos. She spent that first night huddled under a rocky overhang near the collapse, her thin blanket pulled tight around her. The stars emerged, a brilliant, cold spray of light across the blackness. She didn't sleep much. She listened to the night sounds of the desert, the call of a distant coyote, the rustle of some small creature in the brush, and she listened to the profound silence of the mine itself, a silence that felt heavy, sealed, and deliberate. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a silence that was holding its breath. Sadie knew she couldn't break through the rock with a single shovel. She needed a pickaxe, a pry bar, maybe even blasting powder, all of which required money she didn't have. She returned to town at dawn, her resolve hardened by the cold desert night. She found work at the town's only boarding house, run by a tired-looking woman named Mrs. Gable. Sadie offered to wash laundry and scrub floors in exchange for 2 meals a day and a few coins. Mrs. Gable, seeing the fierce determination in the girl's eyes, agreed. For the next 2 weeks, Sadie's life fell into a rhythm of grueling, anonymous labor. Her days were filled with the smell of lye soap and steam, her hands raw from hot water and rough brushes. In the evenings, she would eat her meal of beans and bread in the kitchen, then walk back out to her claim, sleeping under the stars. The townsfolk saw her coming and going, a dusty, solitary figure, and the whispers continued. They called her the Mine Girl, a strange creature wedded to a pile of rocks, but their mockery was beginning to be tinged with a reluctant curiosity. No one had ever worked so hard for something so worthless. Finally, she had enough coin for a pickaxe. The weight of it in her hands felt good, balanced, and purposeful. That afternoon, she began the real work. She started at the edge of the rock slide, not attacking it head-on, but clearing the loose scree and dirt, trying to understand its structure. It was slow, painful labor under a punishing sun. Her muscles screamed, and blisters bloomed on her palms, broke, and hardened into calluses. Days blurred into one another. The pile of rock and dirt she moved grew steadily, a testament to her singular focus. And then, she found the first thing that was wrong. Deep within the slide, she uncovered a large support timber, a thick beam of pine. But unlike the other wood, which was weathered gray and splintered with age, this one was different. The wood was newer, the color of fresh-cut lumber, barely faded by the sun. The axe marks on its ends were sharp and clean, not the dull, rounded edges of rot and time. It hadn't broken under the weight of the rock slide. It had been cut, and it was wedged horizontally, not vertically, in a way that made no structural sense. It looked less like a piece of a collapsed frame and more like a brace, put there to hold the falling rock in place, to ensure the seal was total. It was a deliberate act. The mine hadn't just collapsed. It had been helped. The realization sent a chill through her, despite the suffocating heat. This wasn't just a forgotten claim. It was a place that someone had wanted to stay buried. Forever. The old woman's words came back to her then, clear as a bell. She was finally beginning to listen with her hands. The discovery of the deliberately placed timber changed the nature of her work. It was no longer a simple act of clearing. It was an investigation. Each shovelful of rock, each splinter of wood, was a clue. Sadie worked with a new intensity, her senses sharpened. She noticed how the earth packed around the entrance was different, a mix of local soil and darker, foreign dirt, as if it had been hauled in from elsewhere to thicken the seal. The work was a conversation with the past, and she was slowly learning its language. Her silent companion on these long, solitary days was the old tin canteen. She would take breaks, sitting in the sliver of shade cast by a boulder, and hold its dented surface. She remembered her father's hands holding it, his laugh as he told her it was his lucky charm. He'd been a prospector, a man who believed in the earth's hidden generosity. He had left her and her mother when she was just a child, they'd told her, chasing a rumor of gold in the West. Later, the news had come back that he'd died of cholera in some nameless camp. But holding the canteen, the last piece of him she owned, she felt the story was thin, like a worn-out blanket. The memory of him was warm, kind. He wasn't a man who would abandon his family. Or was he? The doubt was a familiar, bitter taste. A week later, she uncovered another piece of the puzzle. While prying away a section of the original mine entrance frame that had been buried, her fingers brushed against something carved into the wood. The letters were faint, obscured by dirt. She scraped them clean with her knife. A.L. Her breath caught in her throat. Abram Lerner, her father's initials. A memory, sharp and sudden, pierced the haze of the years. She was 5 years old, sitting on his lap while he carved those same initials into the bottom of a small wooden horse he'd made for her. His hands were large and calloused, but his movements with the knife were gentle and precise. The world tilted on its axis. Her father had been here, at this very mine. This wasn't just some random plot of land. It was a place he had known, a place he had worked. The thought was a shock, both terrifying and exhilarating. Why had no one told her? Why was his presence here a secret? The labor was no longer just for survival. It was now a recovery, an act of reclaiming a history that had been stolen from her. The whispers of the town, the sneer on Marcus Thorne's face, the cryptic words of the old woman. It was all connected, a web of secrets with her father's ghost at its center. Her pickaxe felt lighter in her hands, her purpose clear as desert glass. She wasn't just digging for shelter anymore. She was digging for the truth. The final layer was a wall of rock and tightly packed earth, a seal so solid it felt like the mountain's own bedrock. It took Sadie 3 more days of relentless, punishing work to break through. Her arms ached with a fire that never went out. Her hands were raw, and her body was a single, throbbing bruise. But she didn't stop. She was driven by the certainty that she was on the edge of an answer. On the 3rd day, late in the afternoon, the tip of her pickaxe broke through with a hollow thud. It punched into empty space. A puff of stale, cold air, smelling of deep earth and decay, washed over her face. It was the smell of a place that had not breathed for a very long time. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She worked frantically, widening the hole, her hands tearing at the dirt and rock. Finally, it was large enough to squeeze through. She lit the kerosene lantern she'd bought with her last earnings, its flame a fragile yellow eye in the oppressive darkness. She took a deep breath, shielded the flame with her hand, and slid through the opening into the blackness beyond. The lantern light pushed back the shadows, revealing the scene piece by piece. The mine shaft was not the raw, dangerous tunnel she had expected. The walls were shored up with expertly placed timbers. In one corner, a set of miner's tools, a hammer, chisels, a drill, were neatly stacked against the wall, as if their owner had just set them down and planned to return. Against the far wall were a dozen heavy canvas sacks, bulging and tied shut. She nudged one with her boot. It was incredibly heavy, and a corner of it had torn. Through the tear, she saw the unmistakable glint of quartz shot through with thick, unmistakable veins of gold and silver. A fortune. Not just a strike, but a bonanza, the kind of discovery men killed for. But Sadie barely registered it. Her eyes, and the lantern light, were drawn to a figure slumped at the base of the wall near the sacks of ore. It was a skeleton, dressed in the tattered remains of a prospector's clothes. One bony hand rested near a small, leather-bound book that lay half open on the dusty floor. Sadie moved closer, her boots silent in the thick dust. The boots on the skeleton were high-laced, with a distinctive pattern of wear on the left toe. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She knew those boots. She had a faded photograph, the only one she owned of her father, and he was wearing those exact boots. She knelt, her hand trembling as she reached for the leather journal. The cover was stiff, the pages yellowed. She opened it. The handwriting, a strong, clear script, was achingly familiar. It was her father's. The last entry was dated October 12th, 1872. "Thorn came today," it began. He saw the strike. The fool couldn't hide his greed. "I told him our partnership was 50-50, just as we agreed. He laughed, said he had other plans." Sadie's blood ran cold as she read the final lines, her father's words reaching across a decade of silence. "He hit me from behind. My head. I can feel the darkness coming. He's sealing the mine. He means to leave me here with my own gold for a tomb. Tell Sadie, tell my girl I didn't leave her. Tell her I—" The sentence was unfinished, the ink trailing off the page. The truth hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her father hadn't abandoned her. He hadn't died of cholera. He had been murdered. And the man who had killed him, the man who had walled him into his own mine and stolen his discovery, was Marcus Thorne. A storm had been gathering in the high desert all afternoon, the sky turning a bruised, ominous purple. Just as Sadie finished reading the last words in her father's journal, the heavens broke. Rain fell not in drops, but in solid driving sheets. A low rumble of thunder echoed from the canyon, growing into a deafening roar. The desert, so long starved for water, could not absorb the deluge. A flash flood. She was trapped. But the storm outside was nothing compared to the one raging inside her. Grief, rage, and a profound, heartbreaking vindication warred within her. She sat in the silent, dusty tomb, the lantern light flickering, and wept. She wept for the father she barely knew, for the years of believing he had left her, for the casual cruelty of the lie she had been told. She clutched the journal to her chest, his last words afire against her heart. He hadn't left her. He had been stolen from her. The knowledge was both a terrible wound and a healing balm. The roar of water grew louder, a sound like a freight train bearing down on her. A torrent of muddy water began to pour through the opening she had made, carrying rocks and debris with it. She scrambled back, deeper into the mine, dragging the precious sacks of ore and her father's remains with her, away from the flood. The storm was a test, a physical manifestation of the chaos that had just shattered her world. She had to survive it. She had to live to tell his story. As the hours passed, huddled in the dark with the ghosts of the past, she heard a new sound, cutting through the storm's fury. A faint cry for help. Peering out from the mine's entrance, she could just make out the shape of a wagon in the churning brown water of the wash below. One of its wheels shattered. A man and a woman clinging to its side with a small child. They were going to be swept away. Without a second thought, Sadie acted. She grabbed a coil of rope from her father's supplies, secured one end to a solid timber, and braved the storm. The wind and rain tore at her, but she fought her way down the slick rock face, throwing the other end of the rope to the stranded family. One by one, she hauled them up from the floodwaters. The terrified mother, the crying child, the exhausted father. She led them to the relative safety of the mine's entrance chamber, the space she had so painstakingly cleared. She gave them her blanket and the last of her food, a piece of hardtack. The family, shivering and in shock, could only stammer their thanks, their eyes wide with gratitude and awe at this fierce, drenched girl who had appeared out of the storm like an avenging angel. In that moment, sheltering strangers from the fury of the elements, Sadie made a choice. She would not be consumed by vengeance. She would be defined by her father's legacy, not just his murder, but his integrity. The storm would pass, and when it did, she would seek not revenge, but justice. The family she rescued was named Miller. Once the storm subsided and the wash was passable, they made their way back to redemption, and they did not stay quiet. The story of the mine girl who had saved them from the flood spread through the town like wildfire. The narrative began to shift. The fool on the hill was now a hero. The whispers of mockery were replaced by murmurs of respect and curiosity. People looked at Sadie differently when she walked into town the next day, the leather journal tucked securely in her dress. They saw not a pitiable orphan, but a young woman of uncommon strength and substance. Her first stop was the marshal's office. Marshal Brody was an older man, weathered and weary, who had seen too much of human nature to be easily surprised. He listened to Sadie's story in silence, his expression unreadable as she laid the journal on his desk. He read the final entry, his thumb tracing the faded ink of Abram Lerner's name. "I remember Abram," he said softly, his voice raspy. "Good man." Thorne told everyone he ran off. Then, a year later, that he'd died of cholera downriver. He looked at Sadie, his eyes full of a new, sad understanding. "This journal isn't enough," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "It's one dead man's word against the richest man in the territory." "There's more," Sadie said. "The ore." She led Marshal Brody and the town's assayer, a prim man named Mr. Evans, up to the mine. Evans was skeptical, his face a mask of professional doubt, but as he stepped inside the mine and saw the canvas sacks, his demeanor changed. He knelt, slitting one open with a knife. He scooped a handful of the raw ore, his expert eyes widening in disbelief. He bit a piece of the raw gold. "My God," he whispered, his voice shaking with excitement. "This is high-grade telluride, the richest I've seen in a decade. This isn't from the silver vein Thorne is working. This is a whole new lode." He looked from the ore to the skeleton, and then to the journal in the marshal's hand. The pieces clicked into place. The gold was the motive. The journal was the testimony. The body was the proof. They brought her father's remains back to town, and with them, the undeniable truth. The marshal, with the assayer at his side as a witness, walked into the mercantile. Marcus Thorne was behind the counter, just as he had been when Sadie bought the shovel. He saw the grim faces of the two men, saw the journal in the marshal's hand, and his carefully constructed world collapsed. He didn't rage or deny. The color drained from his face, leaving it a pasty gray. The arrogance he had worn like a fine coat fell away, revealing the small, craven man beneath. The chorus of townspeople, who had gathered outside, watched in stunned silence as Marcus Thorne was led away in handcuffs, his head bowed in a humiliation far more complete than any public spectacle. The laughter of the town had finally and forever fallen silent. A week later, at golden hour, Sadie stood at the entrance to her mine. The collapsed timbers had been cleared away, replaced by a new, sturdy frame. A wooden sign, freshly painted, hung above the entrance. The Lerner Prospect. The setting sun bathed the hills in a light that was soft and forgiving, turning the red rock to gold. The air was cool and clean. The world felt quiet, settled. Marshal Brody stood beside her, his hat in his hands. The legalities had been sorted out. The mine and everything in it was hers by right of her father's claim and her own purchase of the deed. She was, by the standards of the territory, one of the wealthiest women in Arizona. "What will you do now?" the marshal asked, his voice gentle. "Sell the claim? Go back east, maybe? Live like a queen?" Sadie looked away from him, her gaze fixed on the vast, beautiful expanse of the desert. She thought of the long journey that had brought her here, the grief, the mockery, the back-breaking labor. She thought of her father, not as a ghost in a dark tunnel, but as a man who had loved her enough to write her name in his final moments. She had found more than gold in this hill. She had found her own story. "It was never about the silver," she said, her voice quiet but clear. carrying the weight of everything she had endured and discovered. It was about getting my father's name back. She had arrived in redemption, seeking a place to survive. She had found a place to belong. She had given her father a proper burial in the town cemetery, with his full name carved on the headstone. She hadn't just cleared a rock slide, she had cleared a legacy. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this incredible story. It's a powerful reminder of the power of memory and a daughter's quiet resolve. If you were moved by Sadie's journey, please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates stories of justice and resilience. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next tale from the forgotten corners of history. Until then,